we were talking about possibly having lunch together. And he looked at me and he said, "But you work for the New York Times. You're probably a vegetarian." I was like, "No, I'm not. I love meat." The New York Times is just such an incredible kind of deep resource. It has bureaus in many different countries. It is incredibly deep, but also quick on the news. So I think that we've done this kind of amazing thing in audio. We've made this podcast that a lot of people listen to, and is kind of a very just sort of systematic move through one idea that really kind of helps people understand the one thing that's most important in the news that day. And I think that we're trying to do the same thing in television.
I really going to try to figure out what happened on the ground.
I had a few moments where I was like, can I do this?
It's a question that we have to answer.
I think certainly we're in an era where describing the work that we do and explaining the work that we do only helps us. There's a lot of talk about journalism and how it operates. The news has become news, and so that's now part of our jobs, is explaining to people what we do, how we report our stories. And so to the extent that we can do that through these stories, that's great. But we're also not trying to make a documentary about New York Times reporters and how New York Times reporters do their jobs. So it'll be part of the story, but we really are trying to tell individual, unique stories in a different medium that sort of stand on their own. They're not films about how to do print.
Can I ask you just a couple more questions?
At that point, what did you guys know about family separation?
It's a totally different type of journalism. I'm not used to having a camera over my shoulder. I'm not used to thinking about how things are going to visually look like. But it was really exciting. I didn't have to be convinced to do it. I mean, there are millions of people that don't necessarily read the New York Times every day or don't listen to the Daily every day. And I think it's a real opportunity for the work that we are so passionate about and work so hard on to reach a totally different audience. So the adjustments are totally worth it.
I had a story about a visiting nurse program, and I was in Iowa, and I was on a farm, and the husband of the nurse I was interviewing, we were sitting at their kitchen table, and we were talking about possibly having lunch together. And he looked at me and he said, "But you work for the New York Times. You're probably a vegetarian." I was like, "No, I'm not. I love meat." So I think people do definitely have preconceived notions about who New York Times reporters are. Liberal people who live in cities, I think generally. People are always surprised that I'm actually from a really, really small town. I'm from a town of 1,800 people. I'm from a town that voted Republican pretty much in every election. It's a very rural place. I also had farming in my background. So, once you talk about these things with people, they feel much more comfortable. They say, "Oh, wow, I didn't, this is surprising to me." We all have stereotypes about each other, I think.
I think another big thing we're dealing with is the assumption that we already know what the story is when we start to report it. So, and people now, I think they're thinking about journalism more. So they're starting to ask me questions and try to use industry lingo, what's your angle? And I'm like, this is day one. I don't know what the story is. You tell me. And so it's also just the very basics of explaining to people what journalism is. And that's, finding out the story through reporting, not deciding.
Something that people don't understand is just the amount of work that goes into doing a story. I think a lot of times people see 10 people quoted in a story and they assume that we talked to 10 people and that was the extent of our reporting, when in reality we may have talked to 500 people, and those were the 10 that kind of summed up what we were hearing from everybody in the most compelling and accurate way. And so that is a challenge we face all the time. And I think the show might get at some of that, show the hard work that we have to do.